to congratulate you. I mean, you came in. And, I thought you were like a voice crying in the wilderness last year. You know, your book got had a lot of success, got a lot of pickup, and I hear a lot more people talking about money in politics today. Even the Senate's about to consider, if they haven't already, this constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. So it's become an issue people are talking about.
Right, and not to mention, but let's mention Zephyr Teachout in New York, who ran a campaign with no money on the issue of money in politics, and out of nowhere got close to 40% of the vote in that primary against Andrew Cuomo. I mean, so this is the moment.
She had she just had a message and, $10 or something.
That's right, exactly right. And an amazing person running with her for Lieutenant Governor, Tim Wu, who's one of the most important people working on network neutrality. He created that term. The two of them were an extraordinary team. So what does it tell you about the issue? It tells us that this issue is important to voters, even if the politicians and the political pundits, that guide the politicians, don't want to talk about it. The politicians don't want to talk about it because they're embarrassed about this issue. It's kind of humiliating to admit that as a congressperson, you spend 30 to 70% of your time raising money. And it's not raising money from all of us, right? They spend 30 to 70% of their time calling the tiniest fraction of the 1%. I calculate it's like something like 150,000 Americans who get these calls from this 30 to 70% of the time that members of Congress spend. 150,000, that's the same number of people in America who are named Lester. So it's the Lesters in America who are getting all this incredible attention from these members of Congress in order to fund their campaigns. That is it's an embarrassment about our democracy.
And in reading David Cole's review of Zephyr, boy, what a name.
Zephyr Teachout.
Yeah.
Isn't that a great name?
Yeah.
I'm telling you. That's from, I don't know, Dickensian novel.
Dickensian model, that's right.
Yeah, it is. But so she's got a book out called Corruption in America, and David Cole's report, he showed that, I guess picking up what you said, that it's like, it's not 2% or 3%, it's like 1,000th of 1%, right?
It's an incredible...
people who write the big checks.
Yeah. Right, and that's not even talking about super PACs, right? For super PACs in 2012, there was 132 people who contributed 60% of the money in the super PACs. And that number, that percentage is going to be much higher in this cycle too. So the point is, we are increasingly outsourcing the funding of our campaigns to the tiniest fraction of the 1%. We've created the green primary in America. There's like 2 stages to getting elected. You got to pass the green primary, you got to win the green primary, and then you get to run in the general election. Mm-hmm. But in the green primary, it's not all of us who get to play. It's the tiniest fraction of the 1%. So, we look back at our past and say the white primary in the South was a terrible, terrible part of American democracy, and it was. Well, we've just created the green primary, and the only the big difference is the white primary, at least it was the majority who got to participate. But in the green primary, it's the tiniest fraction of the 1% who are governing the green primary.
Right. Now, the Supreme Court believes that there's nothing wrong with all this money in politics, right? Because it's a form of freedom, First Amendment right, freedom of speech.
I think the court's position's a little bit more subtle. So one of the great things that Zephyr's book does, and I built on her earlier work when I wrote my book, her book sort of shows, it absolutely shows that the framers of our Constitution had a more subtle conception of corruption than just quid pro quo corruption.
Which the court says, unless it's quid pro quo, it's not corruption.
That's right. But what Zephyr did, and I had research assistants doing the same kind of work, is we went back to the framing of our Constitution. And we had them look at every instance where the word corruption was used. And so we found like 325 times that it was being used. And it was only 6 times out of that 325 where what they were talking about was quid pro quo corruption. The standard thing they were talking about is what we would think of as kind of institutional corruption. It's an institution that develops the wrong dependency. And their big focus was Parliament. Parliament was corrupt, not because people were taking bribes, but because the king had inserted himself into the Parliament by basically being able to appoint members to Parliament and therefore control Parliament. Parliament was dependent on the king. That was a corruption. And what Zephyr is saying about our current political system is that members of Congress are dependent on these funders for their campaigns. They are absolutely dependent, 30 to 70% of the time. The thing they do the most is trying to raise money. And in that dependency is a corruption of the framers' design, because the framers told us we were going to have at least a House, now a House and a Senate, that would be, quote, as Madison put it, dependent on the people alone. And as Madison put in Federalist 57, by the people, he meant, quote, not the rich more than the poor. All right. Well, we've completely lost that sense of their sense of equality.
Well, Congress today is dependent on on the people who write the big checks, but who are generally not there themselves, but represented by their lobbyists.
That's right. I mean, first of all, let me be clear. I think lobbyists are an important part of the system, and I'm not against lobbyists. But as John Edwards used to say when we used to quote John Edwards, there's all the difference in the world back then between a lawyer making an argument to a jury and a lawyer handing out $100 bills to the jurors. And the problem with our current lobbying system is they don't see the difference between those two things. So if we change the way we fund elections, the sort of solutions that Zephyr is talking about, the sort of solutions John Sarbanes is advancing with his Government by the People Act, Jim Rubin's the candidate we backed in New Hampshire. Jim Rubin's has a kind of a voucher funded by tax credits that would support small dollar funding. The point is, any of these solutions would change the location of fundraising from the lobbyist-centered model to people-centered model. So the lobbyists would still be around here, but they wouldn't be the people handing out $100 bills to the jurors. They would just be making arguments to the congressman.
Yeah.